I'm Joeita, and this is The Pulse. I've noticed that when I looked slim, wearing a small or an extra small, shop assistants would be only too happy to help me. Granted, the shop floor would be busy and they would be perpetually understaffed, but the staff was only too happy to help the slim, fit, blind girl find an outfit. Fast forward a handful of years, I'm older now and I've put on a bit of weight, and suddenly when I go to the shop to buy clothes, the staff seems a lot less obliging. Maybe it's because we're having to try out different sizes to find a perfect fit, or maybe it's because I can't find things that fit at all. Or maybe there's something else at play here, something more insidious. Today, we discuss fat phobia. It's time to put your finger on the pulse. Hello and welcome to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Joeita, and I'm really excited about our conversation on fat phobia. I know it's a conversation that many of us have, internally, but often with friends and family, who's gained weight, who's lost weight. And we seem to have a societal fixation with weight and weight loss. And as a result of that fixation, there's a multi-million-dollar diet industry. This magic pill will make you slimmer. This, intermittent fasting is the way to go. Take this, if you just go to the gym 10 times a week, you'll be thinner. We seem to have a lot of ideas about what the ideal body should be, and also how we go about achieving that body, often to our detriment. To help me unpack some of these complicated ideas about fat phobia, I'm joined today by Kate Mann. Kate Mann is an associate professor at the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University and the author of Unshrinking, How to Face Fat Phobia. Kate, hello and welcome to The Pulse. I'm really happy you could join us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You'll have to forgive what might seem like a silly question, but how does a philosopher end up writing a book about fat phobia?
Not a silly question at all. So I have written 2 books about misogyny, and I was often asked after I wrote those books, how did you get interested in the topic of misogyny? And the truth is that I couldn't answer that question without also telling a story about fat phobia, because I was one of 3 girls at a hitherto all-boys school in Australia the year that it integrated and started accepting girls. And I faced a lot of weaponized fat phobia in service of misogyny as a way to take me down and make it clear that I wasn't welcome in that male-dominated space. So I was a then merely chubby teen, but I was subject to a lot of bullying and a lot of, I would say, cruelty because of my weight. I had things like fat bitch scrawled on my locker, which was also doused with fish oil to indicate olfactory disgust. I was voted the person most likely to have to pay for sex at the high school leavers assembly, resulting in an auditorium of boys laughing at my body. And I think that a lot of that fat phobia was done to express hostility towards me as a girl who was intruding on what was boys' turf. But nevertheless, I wanted to really interrogate that phobia to understand its intersection with misogyny, with racism, with classism, ableism, transphobia, and more. And so that's how I ended up writing this book as a philosopher and cultural critic.
And how do you define fat phobia in your book?
I think of fat phobia as the unjust downranking of people who live in larger bodies. I also just use the word fat in a purely neutral and non-pejorative way for people who are larger, much like the word short or tall, or for that matter, thin. To me, it's a merely neutral description of some bodies. But I think of fat phobia as having several strands. So one strand is moral. Fat people are seen as morally irresponsible, as lazy, as lax, as lacking willpower, which is a myth that I try to break down in this book. I think we're also seen as intellectually less than. We're seen as lacking creativity, brilliance, competence, intellectual authority of various kinds, which again I think is quite unfair and bigoted. We're seen as sexually and or certainly when it comes to the dating and marriage markets inferior. And that's kind of an interesting, complicated matter because, as I show in the book, fat bodies, not to put too fine a point on it, are often searched for in pornography. So it's not that fat bodies are just found less attractive. It's that we're seen as lacking in social and sexual status, especially for girls and women. And the final strand of fat phobia that I get into is the health piece of it. The reality is that the relationship between weight and health is complicated, but oftentimes fat phobia takes the form of oversimplifying that relationship and regarding a fat body as automatically unhealthy or even doomed to die of fatness in a way that is inaccurate.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of faulty assumptions that come into play when we think about this notion that fat bodies are inherently unhealthy. First of all, in the book, you talk about BMI and how that may not be the best predictor of health. But you also get into this other idea, and maybe this ties back into the question of morality, that if someone that a fat person has an obligation to get thin because it costs the healthcare system more. Can you help to unpack some of those ideas for us?
Yes, absolutely. So, the first piece of this to look at is that actually the relationship between fatness and health is more complicated than many people believe. So, it can be represented in a nutshell using a U shaped curve where people who have a quote unquote overweight BMI actually have the lowest all cause mortality, statistically speaking. So, in some sense, we're in the healthiest category. I'm in that category now myself. I've been much heavier in my lifetime, but having an overweight BMI turns out to be the category where you're least likely to suffer from premature death. And I should say, I'm using the BMI charts as a reference point here, but it is a very problematic measure in ways we can get into later. Similarly, someone who is in the quote unquote moderately obese category of the BMI charts has no greater mortality risk than someone in the normal weight category. So, again, someone who has a BMI between 30 and 35, their mortality isn't any greater than someone who has a BMI between 18.5 and 25 and is classified as quote unquote normal. Now, we do see correlations between being more than moderately obese and someone also who is underweight. They both will have increased mortality. But it's interesting that we overfocus on people who are very heavy rather than people who are very light in terms of the health risks that we focus on. It's also the case that a correlation between being very heavy, a BMI of 35, 40, then we are starting to see correlations with health problems and greater mortality. It's not necessarily clear that that is causation rather than mere correlation. Because, yeah, someone who is very heavy is also receiving, as I show in the book, inadequate healthcare oftentimes. They may have less access to the means to exercise, which is very healthy, and they're subject to the stress of weight stigma. So when someone insists that someone who is fat is automatically unhealthy and therefore a burden on the healthcare system, they're often missing this complicated picture. And they're missing the fact that I don't think it's right to represent anyone as a burden on the healthcare system. We have the needs that we have, and those should be regarded as valid and legitimate, even if we do have greater healthcare needs at certain very high weights. One analogy that's helpful with this is think about someone who is taking health risks because they're going rock climbing or mountaineering or deep sea diving or bungee jumping or Grand Prix racing, but they're in a presumptively thin, fit, non disabled body. We don't tend to wring our hands about that person who is potentially a quote unquote burden on the healthcare system because we just regard them as entitled to live their lives and generally have humane, fitting healthcare if they do run into problems. So it's telling that we home in a way that I would argue is fat phobic upon people who are fatter. And even if they do have greater healthcare needs in certain ways, in being very heavy, we should be careful about representing them as a burden, which is a pretty tendentious way of thinking about things.
Yes. Often the people who will be on the front lines of this are doctors and nurses. They're the ones that patients are going to, or patients are not going to because they're concerned about their weight, or they feel that, even when I'm sick, I'm not being given the care that I should be given because I'm just being told to go home and lose weight. What do doctors and nurses need to change about the way that they treat patients who are bigger in order to try and remove fat phobia and fat shaming from the healthcare system?
It's such an important question because what we're seeing is that this isn't just implicit bias, this is explicit bias. So doctors will actually just come out and say in surveys that they regard fat patients as a waste of their time, that fat patients are more likely to annoy them, and that they regard fat patients as lax and lazy and irresponsible and have less motivation to spend time with fatter patients. And nurses on some surveys will similarly say things like they're repulsed by our bodies and do not want to touch us. And I think a big part of this is training for medical students of all kinds, doctors, nurses, other kinds of healthcare providers too, that there are enormous amounts of stigma directed at people in larger bodies, which are oftentimes perpetuated through the healthcare system, in part because of some of the structures that don't accommodate a large range of body sizes adequately. There is a lack of medical gowns, blood pressure cuffs, needles, examination tables, MRI machines, all sorts of things that are geared towards thinner bodies, despite the fact that by some measures, arguably 70% of people in North America are fat by some measures. And so this is certainly not an unusual bodily state or condition. And even if it was, we again owe it to patients to have adequate resources in the medical system to accommodate different bodies. I would also say that just for one other piece of it that is quite obvious, um, being weighed as soon as you go to the doctor's office is often not medically necessary or useful. There's no real reason why an encounter that is about your ear infection or strep throat should be begun by knowing what you weigh. And actually, for most medical problems, that isn't necessary. And it can lead to weight shaming on the part of the doctor. And it can just lead to patients being reluctant to seek out medical help because they're going to be weighed as soon as they enter the physician's office in a way that weight inclusive physicians have become critical of and have abandoned in their practices without having negative medical consequences for patients.
One of the areas where people make the correlation between being overweight and being sick is in with respect to diabetes. When you think about diabetes in particular, does the discourse change at all?
So I think it's a complicated matter because there is no doubt that there is a correlation between having greater BMI and developing diabetes. But the interesting thing of it is that we don't really know the causal direction. It could be that, and some people are theorizing in this space who are cutting edge researchers, not philosophers, but medical researchers and epidemiologists, suggest that it's not that weight gain leads to type 2 diabetes, it's that early diabetic processes may cause weight gain. And so that correlation, again, isn't necessarily causal. And even if it is, there's a way in which diabetes is often weaponized in this discourse, where people who have type 2 diabetes deserve humane, fitting healthcare too, and not to be seen as either the butt of a joke or a weapon to wield in an online comment section. So often when I'm writing about these topics, people will say to me, despite not knowing anything about my medical history or my blood glucose levels or A1C levels that happen to be just as they should be at this stage in my medical history, by the way. But they'll say to me, well, you're going to develop type 2 diabetes, enjoy your amputations. And that's just cruelty. That's just bullying. That's just weaponizing a serious chronic condition against people like me who are saying that we need to treat larger people fairly. I suppose that another thing to mention in this space is that when we think about things like type 2 diabetes, the very stigma that attaches to these conditions means that certain people avoid the healthcare that will really help to manage these conditions. So there is a direct relationship between increases in particularly a woman's BMI and her avoiding healthcare altogether. And so that really means that it emphasizes the point that you made in the previous question. We need to find a way to make the healthcare system less fat phobic so that patients are getting the healthcare they need, regardless of their weight and regardless of whether they may have chronic conditions, which again, it's not clear that fat is causing them. It may be that they're causing weight gain. But whatever we find out about this, we should be making sure that people are regarded as entitled to adequate treatment and management of chronic conditions.
Earlier in our conversation, you said that in the book you attempt to explore the intersections of fat phobia with race, class, ableism, and transphobia. Tell us a little bit more about where and how these facets of identity intersect.
Yeah, so one of the ways that they intersect is that it has been shown by the sociologist Sabrina Strings that fat phobia is really rooted in anti Black racism. So, for much of human history, fatness hasn't been regarded as a problem. It's been regarded as a sign of wealth and luxury and abundance and having enough food to eat. And it wasn't until the mid 18th century that fat phobia really became something that was systemic and that was really entrenched. And the way it happened was white racist pseudoscientists theorized completely from the armchair that Black bodies were fatter. Oftentimes, by the way, this wasn't based on any measurements. They'd never been to the relevant parts of Africa, but they were doing it in order to establish supposed differences between white bodies and the Black bodies who were being enslaved so brutally and in ever burgeoning numbers during the transatlantic slave trade. So it's important to get clear on the order here. It's not that fatness was derogated and then associated with Black bodies, it's that Black bodies were derogated in an attempt to justify slavery, and then they were associated with fatness. And that's really, according to Strings's brilliant account, how fat phobia got off the ground and came to be systemic throughout the mid 18th century and into the 19th century and then 20th century, when then the medical establishment got in on the act and started to try to quantify some of these things using things like early actuarial tables that were devised by insurance companies to try to deny larger patients health insurance coverage. And I also draw in my book on the brilliant account of Deshawn Harrison, who they argue in their book Belly of the Beast, the politics of anti-fatness as anti-blackness, that fat phobia continues to play a really oppressive role in oppressing particularly fat Black mask bodies today, where men like Michael Brown in Ferguson, like Eric Garner in Staten Island, these Black men who were murdered by racist white cops, a part of these terrible events, these state executions, these murders, was that they were targeted as fat Black men who were perceived as beastly and as needing to be taken down by police officers. Or in the case of Eric Garner, as so fat that he was going to die anyway, according to the, again, hideously racist police commentary on his being murdered by Daniel Pantaleo, the cop in Staten Island.
In your book, you demonstrate how people who are fat are disadvantaged in education, in employment. We just talked a lot about healthcare. And there's so many examples of that. But the flip side of the coin is that if you are conventionally thin, it confers a great many advantages on you in the way that if someone is white, it conveys a great many advantages on you. What is the role of examining thin privilege in the context of unraveling fat phobia? It's not, so is it just that we have to think differently about bodies that are fatter than the norm? Or do those who occupy bodies that are perceived or coded as thin or slim or fit also have an obligation to try and think through some of the ideas that confer privilege upon them?
I think it absolutely is something where thin privilege is very real, and anyone with a body needs to think through these forms of prejudice, but also privilege. I think you're exactly right. And we see this kind of disparity play out, particularly with respect to girls and women, where there are just huge annual average wage gaps between very thin women and very fat women in the US who are millennials. There is a $40,000 annual average wage gap between them. It's just an enormous, almost a salaries or really a low salaries worth of difference between a very fat and a very thin woman. And the result of which is we have to think seriously about how we're advantaging the thin as well as disadvantaging people who are larger. And I should say I include myself in this. I've been in the quote unquote severely obese category of the BMI charts during my lifetime. And I have lost weight through ways that I detail in the book as being very unhealthy, starvation practices, which were really getting into disordered eating territory. And I now consider myself in the parlance of fat activists, a small fat person who has more privilege than people who are mid fat or large fat or infini-fat, to use again the terminology that is favored in this space, to recognize the fact that all fat people are not treated equally. Someone who is at the smaller end of the fat spectrum, like me currently, has more privilege, more thin privilege, than someone at the higher end of this spectrum, as I once was.
We didn't even get a chance to talk about dieting. I'm looking at the clock and time is slipping away. Where do we go from here? Because there's, body positivity has become a buzzword. Everybody talks about it. But in your book, you argue that we need to go beyond body positivity. So what's next?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that I don't begrudge anyone body positivity if it works for them. I think that's great. For me, tended to have a kind of oppressive quality, almost in the way of toxic positivity. So, this sense of you must be positive about your body or else. So, it didn't really work very well for me. Um, and an option which is, I think, closer to what I believe in is body neutrality, but it can be a bit uninspiring, a bit lackluster to be purely neutral about our bodies. So I began to think when I was writing this book, why do we need the idea of being positive or neutral about our bodies, except if there's always this prospect of being negative about them? What if we threw out this scale and this implicit quantification altogether and regarded the body as not there for correction or consumption or contrast with other bodies? And that is what led me to this idea I call body reflexivity, where my mantra when writing this book became my body is for me, your body is for you, and so on and so forth for every viewer, for every listener, for everyone in the world, and I would argue also every non human animal. Our bodies are for us, and our perspective on our body is the only one that matters. So, getting away from the idea that we need to have this implicit number attached to bodies and rate them positively or neutrally rather than negatively, I think we need to just not be judging bodies at all.
You have a short excerpt from the book that you'd like to read. Why don't you go ahead and set that up for us? Let us know what we're about to hear, and then you could go ahead and read the excerpt from the book.
I'd love to. Thank you, Joeita. This is a part of the book where I've just talked about the phenomenon of thinsplaining, where a particularly obnoxious bioethicist, Daniel Callahan, was talking about how fat people need to be shamed into weight loss. which, by the way, doesn't work because shaming doesn't lead to weight loss, and also doesn't work because we currently don't have terribly reliable, humane methods of making fat people thin. Lots of people lose weight in the short term, but the weight comes back really inexorably for the vast majority of bodies. So here is where I'm talking about this kind of phenomenon of thinsplaining and why actually fat people have a lot of wisdom that philosophers like him would do well to pay attention to. As fat people, we of course know all too well that we are looked down upon for our weight, and that far from making us smaller, stigmatization frequently leads to further weight gain. We are also the ones who know that while living in a fat body may be hard, it is fat phobia, not our fatness, that primarily takes a toll on us. We are the ones who know that fatness is not a death sentence, and that depriving oneself routinely, as diets demand, is not trivial. We are the ones who know that far from being undisciplined, fat people are often extremely disciplined. A lifetime of dieting will make some people's will iron. We are among those who know that an iron will is about as much good as bootstraps in a world that hates you and wants to shrink you. And we are among those who know the most about certain facets of the human condition. For example, we can help dispel the fantasy that bodies are reasonable, by which I mean subject to rational control and capable of being wrestled into submission by that suspect thing called mastery. For bodies are not reasonable. They bend, they sag, they break. They get fat, they get old, they get ill, they become disabled. They die ultimately, and we die with them. That is, of course, frightening. Doesn't everything die at last and too soon, in the words of Mary Oliver? But our bodies are ourselves, as the feminist slogan has it. We are not separate from our bodies, nor are our bodies divided up between the better and the worse parts of our mortal souls, Pace Plato. And when it comes to our appetites, we are all in the end wild ones. So we will have to learn to live with and in our physical selves in all of their glorious and infuriating vulnerability and intransigence. The body's resistance to weight loss is only the beginning.
That's terrific. And it really captures the spirit of the book. I really like the book because it's so accessible in the sense that it's written by a philosopher, but you don't feel like you're reading an academic text. It's very enjoyable to read for anyone from any walk of life. And we didn't even get to talk about the best parts, including fat phobia and philosophy. And there was all this talk about dieting and gaslighting that we didn't get to talk about today. All the more reason to buy the book. Kate, where can we pick up a copy of your book?
Anywhere books are sold, and I'm always partial to your local indie bookseller.
Absolutely. And is it available on Audible as well for those of us who prefer to listen to our books?
Yes, absolutely. And I read the book myself
Oh,
because I am also a huge listener to audiobooks. And I thought because this book has some personal aspects, it might be nice to read them myself to have those memoir parts in my own voice.
wonderful. Well, it was so great chatting with you today. Thank you so much for writing your book and putting it out in the world and for talking to us about it.
What a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Kate Mann, who is an associate professor at the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University and the author of Unshrinking: How to Face Fat Phobia. Well, that's all the time we have for today. If you have any comments, please leave them down below, and don't forget to subscribe, either if you're listening to the podcast or if you're watching on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified about future episodes. If you have any feedback you'd like to write in with your thoughts about the guest or the program or about me, or if you have suggestions for things you'd like to hear on the show, write to us at feedback@ami.ca or give us a call at 1-866-509 4545. That's 1-866-509-4545. Don't forget to leave your permission to play the audio on the program. If you are on X, you can find me at Joeita Gupta. You can find AMI Audio at AMI Audio. Use the hashtag PulseAMI to let them know that the tweet is meant for this show. And of course, you can find Accessible Media Inc. on Facebook as well if you look for their webpage. Well, as I said, I've got to run, but it was a pleasure having Kate Mann on the show to talk about fat phobia, and I do hope you'll pick up a copy of her book. It is truly a wonderful read, and I have enjoyed having Kate very much on the program. The show's technical producer is Mark Aflalo. Ryan Delahanty is the coordinator for AMI Audio Podcasts, and Andy Frank is the manager for AMI Audio. I've been your host, Joeita Gupta. Thanks so much for listening.